The hospital hummed with the typical chaos of a sunny afternoon. The waiting area was a blur of restless movement, parents pacifying children, patients clutching clipboards, and the sharp sound of pagers echoing through the sterile air. Nurses hurried between rooms, their efficiency a sharp contrast to the sluggish pace at which the waiting list moved forward. Amid this hive of activity, a black patient entered, their body language a mix of discomfort and quiet resilience. They clutched their side, visibly in pain, as they approached the receptionist. After completing the necessary paperwork, the patient took a seat near the corner of the room, their eyes scanning the other occupants. Every wince, every shift in their chair told a story of urgency. But as minutes stretched into an hour, it became clear that their condition wasn't being treated with the same immediacy as others. One by one, patients who arrived after them were called in, their names announced with mechanical indifference. The patients' lips tightened, but they remained silent, unwilling to disrupt the carefully maintained order of the hospital. In the midst of the waiting, a white doctor passed by, his lab coat a pristine symbol of authority. His gaze flicked briefly toward the black patient before shifting away, his expression a practiced neutrality that masked subtle indifference. To him, they were just another file, another name on the system, their visible discomfort doing little to prompt concern. A nurse approached him, whispering something, and his head shook slightly before he moved on, brushing past the waiting area without a second glance. The patient noticed this interaction, but said nothing, their eyes following him until he disappeared into a corridor. Other patients began to notice the disparity. Some whispered, their glances oscillating between the patient and the reception desk. Others avoided looking altogether, their discomfort evident. Despite the growing awareness, no one spoke up, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken complicity. The patient's resolve began to harden. They shifted in their seat, wincing as the pain worsened. A nurse, noticing their discomfort, approached but hesitated before speaking. "The doctor will see you soon," she said, her tone polite but hollow. It was a reassurance the patient had already heard multiple times, yet there was no sign of action. The tension in the room was palpable when the patient finally stood, their quiet demeanor replaced with a measured determination. Approaching the reception desk, they calmly but firmly inquired about the delay. The staff member glanced nervously at the computer screen before muttering something about a scheduling error. The excuse felt flimsy, almost rehearsed. Other patients turned their heads, some nodding in silent agreement with the patient's visible frustration. In the corridors of power within the hospital, the white doctor continued his rounds, his dismissive attitude unshaken. To him, the black patient was just another anonymous case, one that could wait indefinitely. He didn't realize that this moment of negligence would soon set off a chain of events that would challenge not just his authority, but the very fabric of the institution. The black patient, however, was no stranger to systemic disregard. Their life had been a series of battles against bias, each confrontation sharpening their resolve rather than breaking it. As they returned to their seat, they resolved that this wouldn't be the end of the story. They may have walked into the hospital seeking treatment, but they were now determined to leave with justice. Unbeknownst to the doctor, the very foundation of the hospital's culture was about to face an unrelenting challenge, one that would ripple through its corridors for years to come. The black patient, though dressed in unassuming attire, carried a quiet air of dignity and strength. Beneath their modest appearance lay a story of resilience and remarkable achievements. They had built a life through sheer determination, perhaps as a successful entrepreneur, an insightful investor, or a dedicated philanthropist. Their accomplishments were not only a testament to their intelligence and hard work, but also to their unyielding commitment to overcoming systemic barriers. Despite their success, they had remained deeply connected to their roots, dedicating their time and resources to uplifting their community. They had established scholarships for underprivileged students, funded community health initiatives, or perhaps spearheaded programs to mentor the next generation of leaders. For them, success was not just about personal gain, but about creating pathways for others to follow. Yet, despite their achievements, the patient often faced the lingering shadow of bias, dismissive attitudes, subtle exclusions, and outright discrimination that attempted to undermine their worth. This wasn't the first time they had encountered someone unwilling to see beyond their surface. Today's visit to the hospital had been routine in theory, but the patient knew better than to expect a straightforward experience. They had felt the weight of prejudice in countless settings before, and the indifferent glances from staff and other patients in the waiting area were all too familiar. Yet they remained calm, their outward composure masking the weariness of having to constantly prove themselves. On the other hand, the white doctor represented an all-too-common archetype in institutions where authority often went unchecked. His sharp suit beneath the lab coat and confident stride projected competence, but his actions painted a different picture. He had built a reputation within the hospital, not for his medical expertise, but for his blatant disregard for patients who didn't fit his personal ideal of importance. For him, patients were not individuals with stories and struggles. They were assignments, files to be handled based on convenience or preference. He had a history of ignoring the needs of marginalized patients, subtly justifying his biases as triaging. His colleagues, aware of his tendencies, often chose silence over confrontation, wary of the friction it might create within the workplace. Complaints had surfaced before, but his seniority and the institution's lack of accountability had allowed him to dismiss them without consequence. The doctor's bias wasn't always overt. He wielded it in ways that were hard to pin down. A dismissive tone here, an unnecessary delay there, a decision to prioritize someone else over a patient he deemed less deserving. These microaggressions added up, creating an unspoken hierarchy in the hospital's treatment of patients. Today, he saw the black patient in the waiting area and made a judgment call, dismissing their discomfort as less urgent than others. It wasn't about their medical need, but about his perception of their value. His glance at the receptionist, his disinterested shrug at the nurse's inquiry, all these actions built a narrative of neglect. But this time, the patient wasn't just another anonymous face to brush aside. This wasn't going to be a fleeting moment of bias that went unchallenged. The doctor's habitual disregard would collide with a force far greater than he anticipated. What he didn't realize was that this patient wasn't just seeking medical attention. They were about to demand accountability and initiate a transformation the hospital desperately needed. The bustling hospital carried an air of urgency, but for the black patient sitting in the waiting area, time seemed to crawl. They had been there for hours, their discomfort growing as others, with seemingly less critical issues, were attended to. Each passing moment underscored the dismissive glances and whispered exchanges from staff that they had endured countless times before. Finally, summoning their patience and determination, the patient approached the front desk. Politely, they inquired about their turn, explaining the severity of their condition. The receptionist, visibly uneasy, hesitated before responding that the doctor was extremely busy. The excuse felt hollow, especially as the patient watched the same doctor chatting leisurely with another patient moments later. Gathering their composure, the patient decided to address the issue directly. They approached the doctor, who was in the hallway, clipboard in hand, speaking with a colleague. "Excuse me, doctor," they said firmly but politely. "I've been waiting for hours, and my condition requires attention. Could you please check my file?" The doctor glanced at them with a mix of annoyance and indifference. His tone was curt, his words dismissive. "There are other patients ahead of you. You'll need to wait your turn." The patient, maintaining their calm, replied, "I've been here longer than most of the others you've seen. My condition is serious and needs attention." The doctor sighed, his irritation now evident. "I'm the one who decides what's serious. Perhaps you should have gone to a different facility if you're in such a hurry," he said, a condescending smirk curling his lips. His words were sharp, his body language dismissive, as if the patient's presence was an inconvenience rather than a responsibility. The humiliation stung, but the patient's resolve only grew stronger. They chose not to engage further, recognizing that arguing in that moment would achieve little. Instead, they turned and walked out of the hospital, head held high despite the ache in their chest, not from their condition, but from the blatant disregard they had just experienced. As they exited, whispers began to ripple through the waiting area. Other patients and staff had witnessed the exchange, their discomfort visible. A nurse leaned toward a colleague and muttered, "That wasn't right." He could have at least looked at their file. Another patient whispered, "Why would he treat them like that? It's not fair." But despite the murmurs of disapproval, no one intervened. The system that protected the doctor's authority and enabled his biases kept everyone silent. Outside the hospital, the patient paused, taking a deep breath to steady themselves. The humiliation was heavy, but it wasn't unfamiliar. They had faced discrimination before, been underestimated, dismissed, and excluded. This time, however, something was different. They weren't just going to accept it and move on. This was a turning point. With their network of connections, resources, and unyielding determination, they began making calls. They documented the experience, reaching out to advocacy groups, community leaders, and even influential figures within the healthcare industry. It was time to shine a light on the systemic failures that had allowed such behavior to persist. The patient's quiet strength and determination turned the doctor's dismissal into the catalyst for change. What had been a moment of cruelty and bias would soon become the foundation for a transformation the hospital desperately needed. The next few days brought a whirlwind of unexpected developments for the hospital staff. Whispers filled the hallways, fueled by a surprising announcement. The hospital had been purchased by a new majority stakeholder. Meetings were scheduled, memos circulated, and an air of curiosity and uncertainty hung heavy over the facility. The truth hit like a lightning bolt. The black patient, whom many had overlooked or dismissed, was revealed to be an influential figure in the healthcare industry. They were a prominent investor with a deep commitment to advancing equitable treatment in medical care. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a statement. News of the acquisition spread quickly. For many staff members, it was a revelation that prompted both shock and admiration. "Did you hear?" a nurse whispered to her colleague in the break room. The person Dr. Carter dismissed outright is now the hospital's owner. Imagine what's going through his mind. Dr. Carter, the senior doctor who had so blatantly disregarded the patient, was reeling. The smug confidence that had once defined his interactions had been replaced by visible unease. He had never imagined that his discriminatory actions would come back to haunt him so swiftly and so publicly. As word of the patient's identity reached his ears, his mind raced with panic. He replayed the incident in his head, each condescending remark and dismissive action now glaring in its inappropriateness. An emergency meeting was called, and the hospital staff assembled in the conference room. When the new owner entered, there was a collective murmur of recognition. The once dismissed patient now stood confidently at the front of the room, addressing the staff with a calm yet commanding presence. "I stand before you, not just as the new owner of this hospital," they began, their voice steady, "but as someone who has experienced firsthand the biases that persist within our healthcare system. My goal here is not only to improve operations, but to transform this facility into a place where every patient, regardless of their background, receives the dignity and care they deserve." Dr. Carter, seated at the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His colleagues avoided his gaze, aware of the tension that hung over him like a cloud. The new owner didn't single him out immediately, but the undertone of their words left no doubt that his actions had not gone unnoticed. "I've reviewed this hospital's records," the owner continued. "I've seen patterns of behavior that are not just unprofessional, but harmful. Change is not optional. It is necessary." As the meeting concluded, the power dynamics within the hospital had clearly shifted. The once dominant Dr. Carter now felt the weight of accountability pressing down on him. His arrogance had led him to underestimate a patient, not realizing that they held the very power to reshape the institution he had taken for granted. The community quickly learned about the transition. Local news outlets covered the story, lauding the new owner's commitment to equity and justice in healthcare. Advocacy groups praised the move, calling it a groundbreaking step toward addressing systemic bias in medical institutions. For the new owner, this wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a precedent. They had turned an incident of humiliation into a moment of transformation, ensuring that no one else would endure the kind of dismissive treatment they had faced. The hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It was now a beacon of change. The new owner wasted no time addressing the issue that had brought them to this transformative moment. Calling Dr. Carter into a private meeting, they maintained a professional but firm demeanor. The doctor entered the room nervously, his usual air of authority replaced by an anxious energy. He avoided direct eye contact, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. "Dr. Carter," the owner began, their tone steady but resolute, "your conduct during my visit here was unacceptable. Dismissing a patient without due attention or care is not only unethical, it is dangerous. That kind of behavior has no place in this hospital." Dr. Carter fumbled for words, attempting to justify his actions. He spoke of being overwhelmed, of misjudging the situation, but his excuses fell flat. The owner interrupted him calmly but decisively. "This isn't about a single mistake," they said. "This is about a pattern of behavior. And, as an institution responsible for the lives and well-being of our community, we cannot tolerate bias in any form." After a lengthy discussion, Dr. Carter was presented with two options: resign immediately or face termination. Recognizing the inevitability of his fate, he chose resignation, leaving the hospital with his reputation in tatters. The hospital released a statement shortly after, outlining its commitment to equitable treatment for all patients and acknowledging the need for systemic change. With the immediate accountability addressed, the new owners shifted their focus to long-term transformation. They spearheaded a comprehensive overhaul of hospital policies, starting with mandatory bias and cultural competency training for all staff members. The training emphasized empathy, active listening, and equitable treatment, ensuring that no patient would feel dismissed or undervalued based on their background. In addition, the patient advocacy program was revitalized. Dedicated advocates were appointed to ensure that every patient's concerns were heard and addressed promptly. The new system provided a clear channel for feedback, giving patients a voice and staff an opportunity to grow. To further improve accountability, the owner introduced enhanced oversight mechanisms. Regular performance reviews were implemented, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior was made explicit. The hospital's leadership team embraced these changes, working alongside the owner to foster a culture of respect and inclusion. The impact of these reforms was felt quickly. Patients who had once hesitated to seek care at the hospital now spoke of a renewed sense of trust and comfort. Staff morale improved, with team members expressing pride in working for an institution committed to fairness and excellence. The hospital's transformation garnered attention beyond the local community. Media outlets highlighted the changes, and other healthcare institutions sought to replicate the model. The owner's leadership became a beacon of inspiration, demonstrating that addressing systemic bias could lead to a more compassionate and effective healthcare system. Through their decisive actions, the new owner not only reclaimed their dignity, but also reshaped the hospital into a place where every patient was valued. Their efforts sparked a ripple effect of accountability and inclusivity across the industry, proving that real change starts with courageous leadership. The hospital began a new chapter under the patient's leadership, transforming from a symbol of exclusion into a beacon of inclusivity and compassionate care. The sweeping reforms implemented in the aftermath of the incident redefined not only the institution's internal culture, but also its reputation in the community and beyond. The patient, now recognized as the visionary leader who had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change, worked tirelessly to ensure the hospital lived up to its new mission. Policies were revamped to prioritize equitable treatment. Staff training became a cornerstone of operations, and patient advocacy programs flourished. Every corner of the hospital bore the mark of transformation, reflecting a commitment to healing, not just physically, but emotionally and socially as well. Staff who had witnessed the initial incident expressed their admiration for the patient's perseverance and determination. Many admitted that the changes inspired them to reevaluate their own behaviors and assumptions. A new sense of camaraderie emerged among employees, driven by the shared goal of providing exceptional and equitable care to all patients. Patients, too, felt the shift. The hospital became a sanctuary for those who had previously feared judgment or neglect. Families spoke of the kindness and attentiveness they experienced, and former skeptics returned with renewed trust. Community members often remarked on the warmth they felt within the hospital's walls, a stark contrast to its former atmosphere. Recognition for the hospital's transformation spread quickly. Healthcare organizations and advocacy groups praised the institution as a model for addressing systemic inequities in medicine. Invitations to conferences, features in publications, and partnerships with other institutions followed, cementing the hospital's place as a leader in equitable healthcare practices. The story culminates with the patient walking through the hospital. On a bright morning, their presence met with smiles and greetings from staff and patients alike. They paused to observe a bustling waiting area, now filled with people from all walks of life, each treated with respect and dignity. Nearby, a nurse offers a comforting word to an anxious patient, embodying the compassion that now defined the institution. As the patient continues their tour, they reflect on the journey, on how an act of dismissal had ignited a transformation that rippled far beyond their initial vision. They stop at a plaque near the entrance that reads, "For every patient, every voice, every life, equity is our foundation." The final scene captures the patient standing at the hospital's entrance, watching as people come and go with a renewed sense of hope. Their face reflects quiet satisfaction and resolve. They've turned a personal affront into a legacy of progress and justice. The story closes with a poignant line: "Health care should heal, not harm. Now, it truly does."